Hello and welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is David Novak. The purpose of this video is to talk a little bit about literary criticism. It's going to be a meandering chat, if you will, responding to thoughts I had based on an article which I read today at artnet.com, written by Ben Davis. I will link the article in the description box below. Now, this article was posted by a friend of mine on Facebook. On Facebook, I'm friends with a few persons who would be properly designated as professional artists. And so when they post an article like this, when one of them posts an article like this, I tend to take note. Literary criticism has been a subject very dear to me, criticism in general. And so this just causes thoughts to percolate. The headline of Ben Davis's article is, "The world's most popular painter sent his followers after me because he didn't like a review of his work. Here's what I learned." And I will give you some little quotes from the article, but I am not quoting verbatim. I'm going to change the words of Ben Davis slightly. For the unadulterated piece, go to the link. A little more than a week ago, I wrote a review of an art show by an artist and TikTok sensation best known for live drawing subway riders. He is, by some measures, the most famous artist in the world, with many millions of social media followers. He did not like the review. It went up on a Friday. On Saturday morning, I woke up to a tidal wave of anger from him on Instagram, tagging me across scores of posts. Hundreds of his followers went on the attack, swarming my Instagram. Loser, hater, pathetic, jealous, you're a dick, and on and on and on. Note, you're a dick spelled the way you would expect online. There were many creative variations on kill yourself. Others said they were going to get me fired, or said things like, "We are going to start a cancellation campaign against you." Let's see. It goes on. It's not the first time that an artist has been mad at me, only the first time that an artist with this particular type of fame has gone out of his way to unleash his fans in this way. It's also not anywhere near the worst or most important thing going on in the world, obviously. Nevertheless, I do think it raises some larger issues worth thinking about. And I agree with him. And as I say, I refer you to the article itself. So I posted this on my Facebook, but I at first posted it as a comment on this friend's post. And so let me read you what I wrote. The first little snippet, again, quotes from the article. "What if he was your son?" someone posted at me angrily. This comment is emblematic. And then it's my voice. "I've seen this kind of thing a lot." Or someone makes a criticism and the response is, "But she has children. How can you say that? Imagine them hearing it," etc. I spent probably a decade arguing for criticism on Facebook Natch, inevitably to get squashed with No one puts up a statue for a critic. Not true, actually. Finally, I think it's a lost battle. I hope I never get near one of these internet teapot tempests on whichever end of it. Still, it's interesting what people do. And what my friend wrote in reply to that was germane. The visual arts, like so many other activities, are suffering from an overload of people who know nothing but think their opinion is valid. If this snowflake ever got near the real art world, he would have a real meltdown. If you can't handle your work being discussed, you really are just too precious to be there. It is actually relevant to point out that Hitler banned art criticism. Is this just a fear of scrutiny of any sort being acted out via this turkey? It's a hilarious cliche that real artists are portrayed as incredibly sensitive, yet none of them would react like this petal and his ignorant fans. Then he came back a couple minutes later and added, I'm guessing whoever said no one puts up statues for a critic could not name a single critic. Just Google statues of John Ruskin. And I replied to that, Google is splendidly helpful sometimes, with the laughing emoji. So this raises all of the points, I think. Now, I have become, and the purport of this YouTube channel has become to talk about my newfound status as a reader. And so that is where I'm trying to devote my energies these days. In years past, I was primarily a writer, and what reading I did was adjunct to that, was generally somehow related. When I was very young, I did some little bits of reading here and there that was just for pleasure. And I'm sure that continued. But the majority of my reading prior to 2 years ago was stuff that was related to my work as a writer, poet, as a matter of fact. And I sort of tongue-in-cheek mentioned arguing in favor of criticism on Facebook, but it's actually true that I would now and again say something. I really do like literary criticism, or criticism of all sorts, and the dogs are aware of something, and we're on the brink of all heck breaking loose, potentially. Come on, kid. And as was the way it went with Facebook back in those days, arguments would come up. And yes, indeed, inevitably, a friend of mine would say there was never a statue erected for a critic. Of course, I was able to Google that right away and disprove that. But when I was young, I would sometimes read, say, reviews of a meal at a restaurant. And at some point it dawned on me that one thing that was often absent with critics was that they did not clearly spell out what their criteria was. Is that criteria, what their criteria were? And well, somebody said, well, that would be too hard to write all that out. But really, I thought, good critics do that. And so they'll take a sentence and they'll say, A good, a good blah blah has a mixture of sweet and sour, with neither the sweet nor the sour overpowering the other. And so right there you've got some kind of baseline, and then another person can come to that and say, I disagree with that statement. I think that the best blah 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 is sweetness predominating with only a hint of sour. It gives room for there to be some discourse. Well, in one of these discussions, a friend pointed out to me that you're talking about reviews, and reviews are different than criticism. And I've come to realize that that's very true. There is overlap. Sometimes critics will write a review of something, and somebody who writes a review is not necessarily devoid of the critical faculty. Pardon me. So, I've lost my train there. Let me try to recapture that. As always, the camera is perched precariously, and if I do anything to reinforce it so that it's much more stable, then it becomes hard for me to press the buttons on it. So I think that we have gone beyond those days. I think we have gotten to a phase where criticism has ceased to exist as a viable option for any writer, except perhaps in the most obscure corners of academia. There is no general public for criticism anymore. Reviews are essentially part of the marketing function of whatever product you're talking about. And where critical thought comes in, it may be helpful, it may not. But the real purpose of a review is to tell me whether I want to buy that book, that item, or not, whether I want to go see that exhibition or not. And if I've come to have a relationship with you, with your writing, or even just as a person, and I know you and I care about your opinions, then I will very much, no, please, no, take that into account. So I apologize for the distracted nature of this. He's just really on today, this orange one. I think criticism is dead. For me, I wrote my last book earlier this year. My last book as such, I'm still writing, and there's nothing to say that I won't compile some of these superfluous poems into a book and call it a book. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm done with the dedicated effort at writing. But even before that, I mean, the trend was known to me. I knew that I was in the declining phase of my literary career. And so, I think we've all known some doctor or lawyer who has spent their whole life working in a field, and then when they hit that retirement and they leave it, that's it. They don't want to have anything to do with it. Well, I'm a little bit like that as far as literary criticism. And so all of my literary criticism has gone to a place where it's hard for me to access. But I thought I mean, were it not for that, I would like to just turn this into a show and tell of my literary criticism books, but they are too hard to get to. But so I thought I would tell, after all this distraction, a little bit about my history reading literary criticism. Again, nothing too intensive. When I was in Taiwan, at some point, and I can't even remember the nature of it, I stayed in some kind of a dormitory or something with another white guy from America, and he was reading this, Semiotics and Interpretation by Robert Scholes, and that really set me on a course. I was actually able to, no, actually he got this, I'm sure, at Cave's Books in Taipei, and he was enjoying it, and when he was done, he said, "Oh, you want to read it?" I said, "Yeah," and then he said, "Yeah, you can keep the book." So I did keep the book. Now, sometimes after that, I did look up other writings by Robert Scholes. He was a very interesting scholar and academic, but for the most part, none of his other books really gelled with me like this one did. And I'll just talk a little bit about what the table of contents contain. All of these were illegal bootleg copies back in the day. The humanities, criticism, and semiotics. Now, back in that day, semiotics, there were all kinds of different forms of literary criticism out and about. If they still exist, they are completely relegated to academia. But back in those days, there was bleed through, and you actually had members of the general public who cared about these things. So the humanities, criticism, and semiotics is the first chapter. Then toward a semiotics of literature, 3 semiotics of the poetic text. Now, semiotics is a word that's not really important to know. I think he's referring to it as signs. I haven't read this in a long time. So any little scribble on a paper, that's a sign which indicates something. Number 4, narration and narrativity in film and fiction. 5, a semiotic approach to irony in drama and fiction. 6, semiotic approaches to Joyce's Eveline. 7, decoding Papa, a very short story as work and text. And 8, uncoding Mama, the female body as text. And it was the last 2 that I liked the most. Number 7, decoding Papa, talking about Ernest Hemingway and a story that he wrote. He deconstructs the story. And then uncoding Mama is similar. I won't go into details about that, but that was probably one of the first things that whet my appetite for literary criticism. And the other, also from my days in Taipei, TS Eliot on poetry and poets. So this was my introduction to Eliot's criticism. Steve Donahue has a video up just a few days ago talking about T.S. Eliot. He's going through an anthology of poets and has interesting things to say. I've seen Steve talk about T.S. Eliot here and there, but I don't think I've ever heard him talk about Eliot as a critic. And Eliot's criticism is on par with his poetry, his best criticism on par with his best poetry. And he is that rarity of a figure who had parallel careers both in poetry and in criticism. I think he mentions that, generally speaking, poets do not write good criticism. If that's not the case, then I have to say I have found there to be some truth to that. Regardless, at least for me, the most valuable criticism came from people who were not poets, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But all of his criticism, at least for people of my generation, was very important. Criticism is not a genre that is necessarily expected to stand the test of time. However, it is vital to the parallel avenue of literary production. I think it was Whitman or somebody who said that without a good audience, you're not going to have good literature. And I think that's absolutely the case. It's one of the things that over the years prompted me to realize that readers are much more important than writers. And as I say now, in my declining years, I am putting my money where my mouth has been and am actually becoming a reader, whereas I was only a reader accidentally by necessity in the past. So this was the first, but I'll show you all of my Eliots because, at least I think it's all of them. There may be one or another misfiled somewhere, but because I don't put Eliot where you can't get to him. He's always accessible. So I think that book on poetry and poets was something of a follow-up to this book, Selected Essays, a big chunker itself. These are really worth looking at. If you know, Eliot's criticism is still of value to our age. He's, you know, and in fact, it's pretty funny. Somewhere he makes an egregious, snarky comment. Well, I'm not going to try to find it because I didn't think of it. Snarky comment about Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold is a critic who also was a poet and also a critic, and actually his criticism has held up probably more than a vast bulk of his poetry, excluding from that, of course, Dover Beach, which seems immortal. But Eliot concludes an essay with a snarky comment about Arnold, but I think actually Arnold is a critic / poet whom Eliot resembles not a little bit. I see the little dust things floating around. We're in the sunlight for one thing, and then I'm down on the ground, and then I've had a lot of stirring up of animal activity right here. So that's the conditions we live with. So did I show you the other Eliot books? And I've also got his Christianity and Culture. I don't know how this holds up. I haven't read this in a long time. Some selected essays. I'll dip back into Eliot for selected essays. Now, as I've said, in the main, I've felt that for me, writers who were not poets themselves were of the most value. And I'll show you a couple of books from there. Edmund Wilson is one. So here's just a couple of his books. Now, he did write little bits of verse here and there, but he was not a poet. There exist 2 volumes published by the Library of America, which might be the best place to start. I have, or at least had at one time, so many books by this man, and they're filled with stuff of varying quality. And so I suspect that the Library of America edition in 2 volumes is probably going to give you the best compilation of most of his work. I've read his letters too, which I enjoyed. And the other critic of very much importance to me was F.R. Leavis. Now, I mentioned Q.D. Leavis in a recent video. That was his wife. They were both critics, and I've read very little by her. I think there's a book or two that they did in tandem, and I would be interested to see that. But for me, the sad fact is that I have moved on from literary criticism largely, even as I've moved on from writing largely. And so now, as opposed to digging out a scholarly tome about commas in the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins, something of lasting value like that, now I actually am more just interested in the opinion of a friend or the opinion of somebody that I watch on BookTube. Anyhow, I apologize for the mess that this video turned out to be in more ways than one. I'm trying to play with new locations. This will probably not be one that I go back to, especially in the full sun, but I do like natural lighting. I will leave it there. If you have any questions about the topic, I went into it with points I was thinking about making, and then, as you can see, things have happened, and I just totally lost track.